The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, brought up from the village by the postmaster's own son, who handed it over the garden gate with the particular caution of a boy delivering something he suspected might not be entirely welcome. Miss Rosalind Ashgrove was kneeling in the frost-hardened soil of her aunt's small kitchen garden when it came, her gloves stained with the last of the autumn digging, and she did not rise immediately to take it. She simply looked at the seal pressed into the wax, a crest of ivy and oak leaves entwined, the mark of the Duke of Alderly, and felt, before she had even broken it, a strange and unaccountable weight settle over her, as though the paper itself understood something about her future that she did not yet. She did not know then that the letter in her hands would carry her away from the quiet, forgotten corner of Sussex, where she had spent the last 4 years of her life, and into a glasshouse that had once been the pride of an entire county, now dying by slow, deliberate neglect behind the walls of Alderly Park. She did not know that the Duke who sent it had already decided, before she ever set foot on his land, precisely how her efforts there would end. And she certainly did not know that by the time the first snowdrops of the following spring pushed up through the thawing earth, her name would be spoken with a respect she had not dared hope for since the scandal that had driven her own family from society some 15 years before. The letter was brief and colder in tone than its ornate crest suggested. Miss Ashgrove, it has come to my attention that you possess some skill in matters of horticulture, learned, I am told, under your late aunt's tutelage. My own head gardener, having departed rather abruptly this autumn, and the position remaining, for reasons of some urgency, unfilled, I am prepared to offer you a trial appointment overseeing the glasshouse at Alderly Park, commencing at once. I will not pretend to expect a great deal from the arrangement. The collection has been sadly neglected these past 2 years, and I confess I hold little hope that a woman of your limited experience can restore what more capable men have already failed to save. Nevertheless, the position is yours if you wish it. Alderly. Rosalind read the letter twice, kneeling there in the cold, her breath visible in the pale morning air, and felt something rise in her chest that was not quite anger, though it shared anger's heat, a fierce, quiet determination she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit. He believes I will kill every plant in that glasshouse within the month, she murmured to the empty garden, refolding the letter with hands that had gone steady despite the cold. He has not yet asked himself what a woman does when the whole world has already decided she will fail. She rose, brushed the frost-damp soil from her skirts, and went inside to pack the single trunk that contained everything she still owned in the world. Before we follow Rosalind any further into Alderly Park, if stories of forgotten gardens, doubted women, and old family secrets blooming back into the light are exactly the kind of tale that keeps you here until the very last minute, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. It always means a great deal to know how far these old stories have travelled. Now, back to that cold Sussex morning, and to the glasshouse waiting for her, 40 miles north, half dead behind its fogged and broken panes. To understand why Rosalind Ashgrove accepted a position that offered her so little beyond the Duke's open doubt, one had first to understand what she had already lost, and how completely a single scandal, 15 years old, had reshaped every year of her life since. Her father, Mr. Charles Ashgrove, had once been among the most respected botanists in the county, a gentleman scholar whose glasshouses at Fenbrook Manor had drawn visitors from as far as London, eager to see his celebrated collection of rare orchids and his experiments in hybridization that scientific journals of the day had called, without exaggeration, groundbreaking. Rosalind, as a small child, remembered him best amid that green and humid world, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, explaining to her with infinite patience the particular chemistry of soil and light that coaxed a stubborn bloom into flower. Then, when she was 7 years old, disaster arrived in the form of an accusation that destroyed everything he had built. A rival collector, a man named Mr. Everard Thistlewood, publicly accused Charles Ashgrove of fraud, claiming that Ashgrove's most celebrated hybrid, a rare crimson orchid that had won considerable acclaim at the Royal Horticultural Society's annual exhibition, had in truth been stolen from Thistlewood's own private collection. Its true origins deliberately concealed. The scientific community, quick to condemn and slow to forgive, turned against her father almost overnight. Invitations ceased. Correspondence went unanswered. Fenbrook Manor's glasshouses, once the pride of the county, were sold within 2 years to settle debts incurred, defending a reputation that could not, in the end, be saved. Her father died when she was 12. Worn down, her aunt always said, far more by the weight of that stolen reputation than by any illness the physicians could properly name. Rosalind had been raised afterward by her Aunt Beatrice, a widow of modest means but considerable botanical knowledge of her own, who had taught her, patiently and without complaint, everything she knew of soil, of light, of the particular quiet miracle of coaxing green and stubborn life from careful hands. She did not know then, tending her aunt's small kitchen garden through 4 quiet years of near poverty, how directly her father's old, unresolved disgrace would come to matter again, nor that the very glasshouse she was travelling toward at Alderly Park held, buried somewhere within its neglected beds and dust-fogged panes, a connection to that 15-year-old scandal that not even the Duke who had summoned her yet understood. She arrived at Alderly Park on a grey November afternoon, the carriage rattling up a long avenue of bare elms toward a house so grand it made Fenbrook Manor's old, remembered glory seem modest by comparison. The Duke himself did not receive her upon arrival. She was met instead by his housekeeper, a brisk, not unkind woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who led her directly to the glass house rather than to any guest chamber, as though the state of the collection mattered rather more in that household than the comfort of whoever had come to save it. The glasshouse, when Rosalind finally stood before it, took what little breath the cold afternoon had left her. It had once, quite clearly, been magnificent, a vast structure of iron and glass stretching nearly the length of the formal gardens, built, Mrs. Whitfield explained, by the current Duke's own grandfather, a man whose passion for rare botanical specimens had once rivaled anything London's finest collectors possessed. But 2 years of neglect, following the sudden death of the previous head gardener and a rapid, disastrous succession of replacements who had lasted mere weeks each, had left the collection in a state approaching ruin. Cracked panes let in the cold. Untended vines strangled more delicate specimens. The heating pipes, essential to the tropical collection's survival through an English winter, had failed entirely in one wing, leaving a graveyard of blackened, frost-killed stems where orchids of considerable rarity had once bloomed. She did not know then, standing in the ruined cold of that once magnificent glasshouse, that the very orchid collection dying around her had been assembled, in part, from specimens acquired decades before under circumstances the current Duke's own family had taken considerable pains to keep quiet, nor that among the wreckage of frost-blackened stems lay the last living descendants of a plant whose true and disputed origin had once destroyed her own father's name. She worked through that first bitter winter with a single-mindedness that left little time for anything beyond the glasshouse's slow, painstaking recovery. She repaired what pains she could herself, learning quickly which of the estate's remaining staff might be persuaded to assist with the heavier labour of clearing the strangling vines and replacing the shattered heating pipes. She salvaged what specimens still showed any sign of life, moving them carefully into the one section of the glasshouse where the old heating system still functioned, nursing them through the coldest months with a patience she had learned, years before, at her aunt's careful hands. The Duke of Alderly, Lord Frederick Vane, observed her efforts from a careful distance those first weeks, having expected, by his own private admission to his steward, to be informed within a fortnight that the position had proven too demanding, that Miss Ashgrove had abandoned the glasshouse as swiftly and predictably as every gardener who had come before her. She did not abandon it. By the second month, though the glasshouse remained a shadow of its former grandeur, the graveyard of dead specimens had shrunk considerably, and new growth, tentative, fragile, but undeniably alive, had begun to show in beds that had held nothing but frost-blackened ruin when she first arrived. He did not know then, watching her from his study window on those cold winter mornings, quite how directly her quiet, determined efforts were about to intersect with a secret his own family had buried for nearly 2 decades. A secret concerning the very glasshouse he had so confidently expected her to fail within. It was in the depths of that winter, while clearing a locked and long-abandoned potting shed at the glasshouse's far end, that Rosalind first found the old journals. They had belonged, she gathered from the careful, cramped handwriting inside, to a Mr. Josiah Vane, the current Duke's own uncle, a man she had never heard mentioned in any conversation at Alderly, and whose name, she would soon discover, had been deliberately, almost systematically erased from the family's official history. The journals detailed, in obsessive botanical detail, years of careful hybridization experiments conducted in secret, in a private corner of the very glasshouse in which she now stood. Experiments that culminated, in an entry dated some 16 years before, in the successful creation of a rare and striking crimson orchid, described with evident pride as a specimen unlike any yet exhibited in England, the product of 11 years' careful crossbreeding, which I intend to submit to the Royal Horticultural Society under my own name, as is only just, having done the whole of the work myself, whatever my brother may believe about the family's claim upon it. Rosalind sat very still in the cold, dusty potting shed for a long while after reading that entry, her mind working slowly through what it seemed to describe, scarcely daring to trust the shape the truth appeared to be taking. She did not know then, holding that brittle journal in her cold hands, that she was looking, for the first time in 15 years, at the true and complete origin of the very orchid whose disputed ownership had destroyed her own father's reputation, nor that the man who had created it, Josiah Vane, had never intended for his family's name to be attached to the theft that followed. The journal's final entries, dated only weeks after the triumphant description of the crimson orchid's creation, told a darker and more urgent story. Josiah Vane, it seemed, had fallen gravely ill that same season, a decline the entries described with increasing desperation, and had entrusted the specimen, along with detailed notes on its careful cultivation, to his elder brother, the current Duke's own father, for safekeeping until his health, God willing, might improve enough to see the orchid properly exhibited under his own name, as he had always intended. Josiah Vane died before that recovery ever came, and in the confusion and grief that followed his death, the orchid and the credit for its creation was quietly, deliberately transferred instead to a family friend and business associate, a man named Everard Thistlewood. In exchange, the journal's final, hastily scrawled entry suggested, for the settlement of a considerable gambling debt the elder Vane brother had incurred and desperately wished concealed from his own wife and household. Rosalind read that final entry with her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the brittle pages into the cold dust of the shed floor. She did not know, sitting there in stunned, disbelieving silence, how completely this single discovery would unravel not only her own father's 15-year-old disgrace, but the entire, carefully maintained story the Vane family had told themselves and each other ever since, that Everard Thistlewood, the very man whose accusation had destroyed Charles Ashgrove's reputation and driven his family from society, had built his own celebrated collection and his own considerable fortune upon a specimen that had never rightfully belonged to him at all. She did not confront the Duke immediately with what she had found. She had learned, in the years since her father's disgrace, precisely how little weight a woman's accusation carried against a settled and comfortable story, however false, and she understood that she would need considerably more than one old man's private journal to unravel a truth the Vane family had spent nearly 2 decades quietly protecting. Instead, she continued her work in the glasshouse through the remainder of that winter with renewed and careful purpose, restoring section after section of the neglected collection, while quietly, patiently, gathering whatever further evidence the estate's old records might still contain. She found, in the estate's own account books, careful entries recording a substantial payment made to Everard Thistlewood in the very month Josiah Vane's journal described, a payment recorded only as settlement of private debt, with no further explanation offered, exactly the kind of deliberately vague accounting a family might use to disguise a transaction they had no wish to see properly understood. She found, among a bundle of old family correspondence, Mrs. Whitfield allowed her to examine, after several careful weeks of quiet, growing trust between them, a letter from the current Duke's own mother, written shortly after her husband's death, expressing private unease about the manner in which poor Josiah's collection came to be dispersed, unease that had evidently never been acted upon, buried instead beneath the family's evident preference for a comfortable silence. She did not know then how soon she would be forced to decide what to do with everything she had learned, nor that the Duke himself, watching the glasshouse's remarkable recovery through that long, difficult winter, had already begun to reconsider, entirely on his own, the confident dismissal with which he had first summoned her to Alderly. By February, the glasshouse Rosalind had inherited in a state of near ruin had begun, unmistakably, to bloom again. The tropical collection, nursed carefully back through the coldest months, showed new growth in beds that had held nothing but frost-blackened stems only weeks before. The orchid collection in particular, the very specimens whose disputed history she now understood so much more completely than anyone else at Alderly, flourished under her careful attention in a manner that even the estate's oldest remaining gardener admitted he had not seen since Josiah Vane's own celebrated years managing that same glasshouse decades before. The Duke began, that winter, to visit the glasshouse himself with increasing frequency, not, at first, to converse with Miss Ashgrove directly, but simply to observe, with a curiosity he had not expected to feel, the slow and remarkable transformation taking place beneath the glass. "You have accomplished, in a single season, what I confess I did not believe possible," he told her finally, one cold February afternoon, standing amid a row of orchids just beginning to show their first tentative buds. "I wrote to you last autumn expecting, quite candidly, to be informed within a month that the position had proven beyond your capabilities. I find myself instead rather thoroughly humbled. I am glad to have proven your Grace's expectations wrong," Rosalind said carefully, watching him with the particular attentiveness of a woman deciding at last whether the moment had finally come to share what she had discovered. She did not know, standing there in the humid warmth of the glasshouse she had spent an entire winter restoring, that the Duke's own growing respect for her work was about to be tested rather more severely than either of them yet anticipated, nor how he would receive the truth she had, until that very afternoon, been so carefully and deliberately withholding. She told him everything that evening in his own study, laying Josiah Vane's brittle old journal upon his desk alongside the account book entries and his own mother's uneasy, unresolved letter. She explained, as plainly and as carefully as she was able, precisely how the Crimson Orchid's true and disputed history connected not only to his own family's quietly buried shame, but to the public disgrace that had destroyed her father's reputation and her family's entire fortune 15 years before. The Duke read every document in silence, his expression shifting by careful degrees from disbelief to a discomfort that settled finally into something that looked very much like genuine grief. "My father," he said at last, very quietly, "allowed an innocent man's reputation to be destroyed, to conceal a gambling debt he was too proud to confess to his own family." "I do not believe you knew any of this, Your Grace," Rosalind said. "I do not believe it is a fault of your making, but I believe it is, perhaps, the only fault remaining in your power to properly correct." He did not know, sitting there in the candlelit quiet of his own study, how directly this discovery was about to reshape not only his understanding of his own family's history, but the entire trajectory of the woman standing before him. The very woman he had once so confidently predicted would kill every plant in his neglected glasshouse within a month. The weeks that followed unfolded with a careful, deliberate purpose neither of them had anticipated when Rosalind first arrived at Alderly's gate the previous November. The Duke wrote, at Rosalind's own careful urging, to the Royal Horticultural Society, laying before its committee the full and documented history of the Crimson Orchid's true origin, Josiah Vane's own journal, the estate's account books, and a formal statement acknowledging, on behalf of his family, the injustice done both to his late uncle's memory and to the reputation of Mr. Charles Ashgrove, wrongly accused of a theft he had never in fact committed. The society, to its credit, did not dismiss the claim as easily as it had once dismissed Charles Ashgrove's own desperate protests 15 years before. A formal review was convened that spring, and the evidence, laid out with the same careful, patient precision Rosalind had learned tending her aunt's garden through 4 quiet years of obscurity, proved impossible to responsibly deny. She did not know, waiting through those long weeks of formal review, how completely the society's eventual verdict would restore not merely her father's posthumous reputation, but her own standing in a world that had, for 15 years, known her only as the daughter of a disgraced and forgotten man. The verdict, when it finally arrived in the second week of March, was unequivocal. The Crimson Orchid's true origin was formally and publicly credited to Josiah Vane, its wrongful attribution to Everard Thistlewood corrected in the society's own permanent records, and Charles Ashgrove's name, the name Rosalind had carried through so many quiet, difficult years of doubt, was formally and publicly cleared of any wrongdoing whatsoever, the original accusation against him acknowledged at last as the fabrication it had always been. Rosalind wept, reading that formal letter, in a manner she had not allowed herself since her father's death, not from grief this time, but from the particular, overwhelming relief of a burden she had carried so long and so quietly, that she had nearly forgotten what it might feel like to finally set it down. The glasshouse itself, meanwhile, continued its remarkable recovery through the final weeks of that long winter, and by the time the first snowdrops pushed up through the thawing beds of Alderly's formal gardens, the collection Rosalind had inherited in a state of near ruin had become, by any fair comparison, considerably more magnificent than the celebrated collection Everard Thistlewood had built in the years since, upon a stolen reputation the society's own records now formally acknowledged had never rightfully belonged to him. She did not know. That first morning, she walked the glasshouse's restored rows and found the Crimson Orchids, Josiah Vane's true and rightful creation, blooming for the first time in nearly 2 decades. How completely that single, quiet moment would come to define everything she had endured to reach it. Word of the restoration spread that spring with considerably more warmth than the county's gossip had ever shown her family before. Where once the name Ashgrove had been spoken only in careful, pitying whispers, it was now mentioned with genuine admiration. The daughter of a wrongly disgraced botanist who had travelled 40 miles on nothing more than a duke's grudging trial offer, and had restored, in a single remarkable season, both a neglected glasshouse and her own family's long-buried name. The Duke himself, that spring, extended an invitation few at Alderly had ever expected to see, offered to a woman who had arrived, the previous November, as little more than a servant hired on sufferance. He asked that she remain not merely as head gardener, but as curator of the entire collection, with full authority over its future direction, a position, he acknowledged plainly, that ought properly to have belonged, by rights of inheritance and talent both, to Josiah Vane's own family, had circumstances allowed it. "I was entirely wrong about you, Miss Ashgrove," he told her, standing amid the blooming orchids on a warm April morning, sunlight pouring through the glasshouse's newly repaired panes in a manner that would have seemed, only months before, an impossibility. "I predicted you would kill every plant in this glasshouse within the month. I find myself instead standing in the finest collection this county has seen in a generation, considerably finer, by every honest account, than my own family ever properly deserved to claim." "You did not know the truth of it then, Your Grace," Rosalind said. "Few of us are entirely wrong about the people we doubt, nor entirely right. I have found, this past winter, that most judgments made too quickly deserve rather more patience than they are usually given." She did not know, saying those words, how completely they would come to describe not only the Duke's own mistaken prediction, but the entire slow, painful, and finally vindicated arc of her family's 15-year exile from a world that had judged her father too quickly and had taken considerably too long to admit its error. By the time full summer arrived at Alderly Park, the glasshouse Rosalind Ashgrove had rebuilt from near ruin stood recognised, by the Royal Horticultural Society's own formal acknowledgement, among the finest private collections in England. Its crimson orchids, restored at last to their rightful name and history, drawing visitors from as far as London, much as her own father's celebrated glasshouses had once done, in the years before a single false accusation destroyed everything he had built. She did not remain merely a curator hired on trial, nor merely the daughter of a man once wrongly disgraced. She became, in the seasons that followed, something considerably more enduring than either, a botanist in her own right, whose careful, patient restoration of a dying collection had proven, beyond any further doubt, precisely what a woman dismissed too quickly by the world could accomplish, given only the chance and the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept the ending others had already written for her. Years later, when the story of Alderly's glasshouse was told, as it was told often in drawing rooms and garden societies alike, growing gently more remarkable with each retelling, it always began the same way, with a Tuesday morning, a cold garden gate, and a duke's confident, careless prediction. "She'll kill every plant in that greenhouse," the duke said. And it always ended the same way too, with the spring that followed, proving him not merely wrong, but wrong in a manner that restored, alongside a dying collection of rare and celebrated orchids, a family's name that had waited 15 long years for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to finally set the truth right. If Rosalind Ashgrove's story stayed with you tonight, let us know in the comments which part moved you most. And don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten tales of England's old estates and the women who quietly, patiently proved everyone wrong. There is always another garden, somewhere, waiting to bloom again.